In this episode, I want to talk about the most dangerous piece of advice in supplement marketing. And it's dangerous precisely because it's half right. You've even heard me say it. The advice is educate your customer. You've heard it 1,000 times. Teach the market, add value, explain the science, and the sales will follow. And there's real truth in it, but there's a trap hiding inside that advice that quietly kills a lot of supplement brands. And almost nobody talks about it because most education doesn't build your brand. It builds the category. You spend the money teaching people why an ingredient works, and then they go buy that ingredient cheaper somewhere else. You paid to educate a prospect right into a competitor's cart. So today we're going to look at a brand that figured out how to educate in a way that builds a moat instead of a leak. The brand is Seed. And by the end of this episode, you're going to understand the difference between education that commoditizes you and education that makes you the only choice. It's one of the most important distinctions in the entire business of supplements. If you're just finding this series, this is part 5 of the next wave, where we're pulling apart the supplement brands scaling right now and the specific moves behind them. We've looked at sharp positioning with Array. We looked at belief with Primal Queen and high intent problems with Mars Men. Today we're looking at the supplement brand called Seed and the art of education as a moat. Each episode stands on its own, so you're fine starting here. Okay, let's get to it. Welcome to Health Business Mastery, the Creative Thirst podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Hewitt. So let me start with the trap itself, because you have to really feel the problem before Seed's solution makes sense. Imagine you sell a magnesium supplement and you decide to do content marketing the right way. You build out beautiful blog posts and videos explaining why magnesium matters, how it helps with sleep and stress and muscle recovery, what the research says, which forms are most absorbable, really good content, genuinely helpful and educational. And it works. People find your content, they learn a ton, they become convinced they need magnesium. And then a big chunk of them open a new tab, go to Amazon, and buy the cheapest, well-reviewed magnesium they can find. Because you didn't teach them why they need your magnesium. You taught them why they need magnesium. And magnesium is a commodity. Anybody can sell it. You just spent your marketing budget growing demand for an entire category, and the lowest cost seller gets to harvest most of it. That's the education trap, and it's everywhere in this industry. Brands pour money into educating the market about ingredients, and in doing so, they train their own prospects to become smart shoppers who buy on price. The more you educate about the ingredient, the more you commoditize yourself. It's one of the great hidden wastes in supplement marketing, and it feels productive the whole time you're doing it, which is what makes it so dangerous. The distinction that saves you is this. There's education about the ingredient, and there's education about your mechanism. Education about the ingredient helps every brand that sells that ingredient, including the cheap ones. Education about your specific mechanism. The mechanism is your particular supplement's way of solving the problem. One builds the category, the other builds a moat, and Seed built a moat. So let me paint the picture on Seed, because how they're structured tells you everything about the strategy. Seed was founded in 2015. For most of their history, they sold exactly one product, a probiotic. They've since grown past 2 million customers and reached the top position in the U.S. digestive health probiotic category, and they've built a following of something like 7 million on Instagram, largely on the back of science education. But at the core, it started as a single hero product backed by an enormous amount of education. Now let's talk about what Seed actually does differently, because on the surface, it looks like they're just doing more science content than everyone else. But it's not the volume that matters. It's the type. The first thing Seed does is they don't educate about probiotics in general. They educate about why most probiotics fail, and then they position their specific mechanism as the answer. That's a crucial difference. If Seed just taught you that probiotics are good for your gut, they'd be growing the whole probiotic category. Instead, their education is built around the idea that most probiotics don't even survive the trip through your stomach acid, that most of them are measured and manufactured in ways that don't guarantee the bacteria are alive and active by the time they reach where they need to go. So the education isn't probiotics are good. The education is, here's why the probiotic you're already thinking about buying probably won't work, and here's the specific mechanism that fixes that. By the time a prospect finishes learning from Seed, they haven't just learned that they want a probiotic. They've learned that most probiotics are inadequate, and they've learned the specific criteria that separate a real one from a fake one. And those criteria happen to be exactly the things Seed does. The education doesn't send them shopping. The education disqualifies the competition. The second thing Seed does is they invent and own the language of the category. They talk about testing for AFU, active fluorescent units instead of the CFUs, colony-forming units that everyone else uses. They gave their delivery technology a proprietary name. They used the word symbiotic, combining probiotic and prebiotic, rather than just probiotic. And this matters more than it seems. When you teach the market using language that you own and that points back to your specific product, the education can't be transferred to a competitor. A prospect who now believes active fluorescent units are the real measure of a quality. Probiotic has been handed a ruler that only Seed measures up on. You've educated them, but you've educated them in a way that only validates you. This ties directly into the marketplace sophistication idea I come back to often. In a sophisticated market, and the probiotic buyer is now very sophisticated, the old promises don't land anymore. People have heard supports gut health 1,000 times. What Seed did was raise the level of the conversation above where the whole category was competing. While everyone else was shouting the same tired promise, Seed changed the criteria the buyer uses to judge the entire category. And when you get to set the criteria, you win, because you set criteria that you uniquely meet. The third thing Seed does is they protect the quality of their education as they scale. They built something called Seed University. It's a training program that anyone who wants to promote Seed as an influencer or affiliate has to complete, and they have to pass an exam before they're allowed to talk about the product. So instead of handing influencers a discount code and hoping they don't butcher the science, Seed requires them to actually learn the material and prove it. The people spreading the message are scientifically literate about the specific mechanism, which keeps the education consistent and credible, even across thousands of outside voices. Think about what that accomplishes. Most brands, when they scale influencer marketing, watch their message get diluted and garbled as more people repeat it badly. Seed did the opposite. They built a system that makes their moat stronger the more they scale it, because every new advocate is trained to reinforce the exact same mechanism-based education. That's a defensible, compounding advantage, and it grew directly out of taking the education itself seriously as the core of the brand, rather than as an afterthought. Now let me connect all of this back to my 4 buying forces, because underneath the strategy, this is really a trust and belief story, and it's worth seeing that clearly. Trust is one of the forces that both pushes and pulls a supplement buyer. And Seed's whole education engine is a trust manufacturing machine. By leading with rigor, peer-reviewed research, named strains, precise measurement, a scientific advisory board full of researchers from serious institutions, Seed pulls the skeptical functional side of the buyer's mind toward them. In a category absolutely flooded with junk and wild claims, being the brand that's almost annoyingly rigorous becomes the differentiator. The rigor itself is the trust signal. But it's also a belief play, because seed is shaping what the buyer believes a good probiotic even is. Remember, you can't easily argue someone out of a belief, but you can be the one who forms the belief in the first place. Seed gets to the buyer early, often before the buyer has any fixed belief about how to judge a probiotic, and they install the belief system. Survival through stomach acid matters. Precise measurement matters. Strain specificity matters. Once that belief is installed, every competitor gets judged by Seed's rules. That's belief formation as a moat, and it's incredibly powerful because the buyer doesn't experience it as marketing. They experience it as having gotten smarter. And that's the real magic of education done right. The buyer feels like they're learning, not being sold. Their guard is down. They're grateful for the education. And in the process, they absorb a belief system and a set of criteria that make your product the obvious answer. It's the least resistant, most durable form of persuasion there is, because the buyer builds the conclusion themselves and feels ownership over it. But when you build your whole brand on scientific education and rigor, you set a very high bar and you invite scrutiny against that bar. And Seed does get scrutiny. There are gastroenterologists and science writers who point out that the educational content, while generally accurate about the microbiome in general, can leave an impression that the specific product is more clinically proven than the published evidence on that exact formula actually supports. In other words, the education about the category can create a glow of validation around the product that runs a little ahead of the direct proof. When you live by the science, critics will hold you to the science, and any gap between the rigor of your story and the rigor of your specific evidence becomes the thing people poke at. There's also a slower burn risk with the education as a moat model. It's expensive and it's slow. You're not going to build a Seed-style moat with a week's worth of ads. It takes years of sustained, genuinely high-quality content and real scientific investment to install a belief system across a market. So it's a powerful strategy, but it's a patient one, and it's not the right fit for a brand that needs to hit a number this quarter. Go in understanding that you're building an asset over time, not flipping a switch. Okay, let's make this practical for your brand, because the education trap and the education moat apply to you no matter what you supplement you sell. The first thing to do is audit your current education against one simple question. Does my content teach people why they need my product, or does it teach them why they need my category? Go look at your blog, your ads, your emails, your videos, and be honest. If your content would work just as well with a competitor's logo slapped on it, you're funding the education trap. You're growing the category and training price shoppers. That's the leak, and most brands have it and don't realize it. The second move is to find or create your own mechanism to educate around. You need a specific reason your product works that isn't just the generic ingredient. It might be a delivery method, a particular combination, a sourcing story, a measurement standard, a formulation process, something that's true about your product specifically. And then all of your education should orbit that mechanism so that learning about the problem naturally leads to your specific solution rather than to the category at large. If you don't have a mechanism yet, finding one is some of the highest value strategic work you can do, because without it, your education will always leak. The third move is to consider owning the language. Seed didn't have to invent AFUS, but doing so gave them a ruler that only they measure up on. Is there a term, a standard, a way of framing quality in your category that you could define and own? One that happens to point straight back to what makes you different. When you own the language people use to evaluate the category, you quietly tilt every comparison in your favor. And you do it in a way that feels like education rather than salesmanship. And the fourth move, if you go down this road, is to protect the education as you scale. However you spread your message, through your own team, through affiliates, through influencers, build a way to keep the science accurate and consistent as more voices repeat it. Seed University is the gold standard version of this, but even a simple, well-made training document for anyone who speaks for your brand goes a long way. The moat only holds if the education stays sharp as it spreads. So let me pull this all the way back to why this matters more in supplements than almost anywhere else. Supplements are a trust-dependent, skeptical purchase. The buyer can't see the product working. They can't easily verify the claims. They've been burned before, and they know the category is full of junk. In that environment, education isn't just a nice content strategy. It's one of the only ways to build the trust and the belief that a supplement sale actually requires. But because education is so central here, getting it wrong is costly. Educate about the ingredient, and you fund your commodity competitors. Educate about your mechanism, and you build something no one can take from you. That's the whole lesson of Seed. They took the single most overused piece of advice in this industry: educate your customer. And they did it in the one way that actually compounds in their favor, instead of leaking out to the category. They taught the market to judge probiotics by criteria that only they meet. They wrapped it in real rigor, and they protected it as they scaled. One product, an enormous moat, built almost entirely out of education, pointed in the right direction. So, here's what I want you to do after this episode. Pull up your single best piece of educational content, the one you're proudest of, and ask the hard question. If a prospect consumed only this, would they be more likely to buy from me specifically, or just more likely to buy the ingredient from whoever's cheapest? If it's the second one, you've found your leak. And turning that content from category education into mechanism education is one of the most profitable things you could do this quarter. Next episode, we move into the last bucket of the next wave, the premium targeted brands. And I want to zoom out from single brands and look at a trend line instead. We're going to use Ritual, Hume, Needed, and Gainful to unpack how specificity is quietly becoming pricing power and why personalization is shaping up to be the next real frontier in this category. It starts to point us toward where all of this is heading, which is exactly where we'll take the finale. I'll see you there. And if this episode made you realize you've been pouring money into education that's been quietly feeding your competitors, that's a fixable leak, and closing it is some of the highest leverage work in your whole business. If you'd like a team that does supplement buying psychology and positioning for a living to help you build education that actually compounds in your favor, that's what we do at Creative Thirst. We specialize only in dietary supplements. We take on a small number of brands at a time, and we're selective about who we bring on. If that's where your brand is right now, you can apply to work with us at creativethirst.com.